Okay, so welcome to the SFP Fresh and Frozen Tuna Supply Chain Roundtable webinar on longline bycatch. Thanks very much for joining us. I do appreciate everyone rescheduling their diaries for me. I do appreciate it. Thank you very much. Both myself, Tom Pickerel, Tuna Director at SFP, and my colleague Alexia Morgan, SFP's Tuna Science Lead, will be presenting today. We're going to be doing a bit of a tag team on different sections of the presentation. You've got, I think everyone's muted already. There will be time for questions at the end. You can use the chat function to bookmark questions during the webinar if that's helpful, and we can go through them at the end. But like I say, there will be time at the end for having a discussion as required. Of course, if you'd rather ask questions privately, please feel free to drop me a line, email me or Alexia, and we'll get back to you privately as well. Okay. So back in March, SFP, in collaboration with 3 other environmental organisations, Greenpeace, BirdLife International and the Nature Conservancy, released a report for seafood supply chains that contains advice on minimising bycatch of threatened species in longline tuna fishing. And in May of this year, SFP and TNC hosted a workshop in Bangkok to coincide with the Infofish Tuna Conference. This workshop was to support the implementation of the recommendations from the report by seafood supply chain companies and provide an opportunity to discuss bycatch management issues with fisheries bycatch experts. This webinar today is building on that workshop, taking a lot of the messages and the outcomes from it, and aims to demonstrate the impacts of pelagic longline bycatch, set out the steps that can be taken to ultimately reduce bycatch in longline fisheries, and to support the implementation of the mitigations identified in the report through a pilot or pilot studies, and much more on that as we go through. So this is the first tag team. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alexia, who's going to talk about the actual longline fishing and bycatch itself. Are you there, Alexia? Okay, so I'm having a bit of trouble getting Alexia. I'm just going to check whether she is available. Okay, well, in the meantime, I will keep going with the presentation. So this section is going to actually look at longline fishing and the actual impacts of bycatch. This diagram here sets out longline fishing. The typical gear type there, you can see there is a main line which is from the boat, leads backwards anyway up to several hundred meters, and it has lines, branch lines coming down, also known as snoods, which end up via a leader onto a baited hook. There's also often there can be buoys holding the main line up. So this gives you an idea of a sort of a standard gear layout for longline. In terms of bycatch itself, pelagic fisheries do capture many species in addition to their targets, which is, in our case, we're interested in tuna. Of the species that are caught, it's the long-lived ones that we're particularly interested in, because these are very vulnerable to bycatch mortality. So that is the very vulnerable to deaths caused by the long line. Now, so therefore, management of bycatch from long lines is hugely important, and unfortunately it's very minimal by the RFMOs, and it even varies by individual country and within countries. So it's an important area for us to focus on. In terms of some of the species that we're interested in looking at, there are 4, well, there are 3 we're going to focus on. Richard can't hear. Let me just... Right, I'm going to have to carry on. Um, right. Okay. Okay. So we're going to be looking at sharks, seabirds, and sea turtles as the species we're most interested in. Ah, right. Okay. I think Alexia has. Have you? Are you there, Alexia? No. Okay. So apologies for this. Well, I'm glad Richard can hear now. Okay. So unfortunately, Alexia is not able to speak at the moment. So I'm not sure what's going on with the software. So I'll just continue. Um, okay. So we're focusing on sharks, seabirds, and sea turtles as in terms of the key species we're interested in. As you can see here, up to a quarter of the total catch in some pelagic longline tuna fisheries are shark species. And unfortunately, some of the commonly caught shark species are rated vulnerable by IUCN. In terms of sea turtles, the sea turtle bycatch occurs primarily in the tropics and subtropics region, which obviously overlaps greatly with tuna fisheries. There's different ways that different turtles can get caught up in long lines. The hard shells turtles tend to go for the bait themselves and get hooked through the mouth as they go for the bait, whereas leatherbacks can get caught by becoming hooked on the lines across their bodies through their flippers. Turtles can also be entangled in the branch lines or the floats and ends up in them drowning. And it's estimated that tens to hundreds of thousands are caught annually, and up to a quarter of them are dead when the lines are brought in. Seabirds are most frequently caught during longline setting, and that's important because that's where the mitigations come in. They can be hooked or entangled while going for the bait on the hooks, and they get to be, if they get caught up in the hooks or the lines, they get dragged underwater where they can drown. It's about 1,600, at least 100, at least 160,000, probably in excess of 320,000 seabirds are killed every year by longline fishing. And I mean, the shocking statistics are that one third of all seabirds are threatened with extinction, including 15 out of the 22 species of albatross alone. And these are animals that are, they feed on the high seas where a lot of the tuna fishing occurs. As well as the direct impacts on the species themselves, there are wider ecological impacts of longline bycatch. You have changes to the abundance of other species, which can cause trophic cascades, where you have the diagram there shows you a reduction in the top predator, leads to an increase in the next level predator, which then leads to a decrease in the next level, so on. This can also result in behavioural changes of the species involved in the trophic levels, and generally it's a negative impact on the ocean. So I think there's a universal awareness that longline bycatch is a bad thing. How do we go about solving it? In this section, we're going to explore the already existing techniques and practices that can reduce longline bycatch mortality, taxa by taxa. There are a number of effective and commercially viable methods that are already in existence and already in operation in some fisheries throughout the world. In many cases, it's not just one measure is used, but a suite of measures can be used synergistically to reduce bycatch mortality. However, there is yet no silver bullet that eliminates all bycatch mortality, and different mitigation measures can impact different species differently, and we will hear about that. We thought we'd begin with sharks, seeing as it's Shark Week. Now, shark bycatch can be reduced through prohibiting the use of wire leaders or shark lines, prompt and safe handling and release of incidentally captured sharks, and shorter soak times. Now, over the next few slides, I'll explain what each of these mean and what they are. So wire leaders. Many longline vessels use a wire leader to secure their hooks onto the main line. So it's pretty much just a connector. Studies have been conducted that show if you replace a wire leader with a nylon monofilament, it actually has reduced bycatch of sharks, as the catch rate of sharks is higher on wire leaders than on nylon leaders. So why is that? Well, when caught on a wire leader, the sharks can remain hooked for hours until the long line is hauled back onto the boat. But when using a nylon monofilament leader, sharks are able to use their teeth to bite through the material and escape. And escapees on nylon leaders are expected to suffer less injury and stress than sharks caught on wire leaders. Now on to prompt and safe handling and release. By all appearances, sharks look pretty robust, and it was easy to assume that they can sustain rough handling or extensive exposure and still survive when returned to the sea. But sharks do not have a hard skeleton of bone to protect their internal organs, and when they're out of the water, the weight of gravity can tear their connective tissue, resulting in crushed or damaged organs. Furthermore, a shark's head holds a number of sensitive organs used to detect prey, and if handling damages these organs, then the shark, once it's put back in the water, can be unable to locate prey and starve. Safe handling and release refers to using best practice methods for dealing with bycatch species to maximize their chances of survival after interacting with fishing gear. Plenty of guides exist for safe handling and release of sharks. The images I've used come from a longline fisher's guide which has been produced by ISSF, and they give you a number of different things to do that can be done on board a vessel to minimize negative handling of sharks. Finally, shorter soak times. Now, soak times is the length of time that the hooks are in the water. Now, pelagic longlines can be often soaked for 20 hours or longer during normal commercial fishing operations, and studies have suggested that a reduction in soak time would increase the survival of bycatch that's caught on the line, for example sharks. It's not going to do much for seabirds or turtles, for example. But there has, I mean, this is a terrible graphic that doesn't really show much of a reduction, but it was difficult to find one. But there have been studies that say that there is an impact on shark survival. Studies have found that sea turtle bycatch can be reduced through the following things: the use of large circle hooks, using fish as bait rather than squid, setting the long lines deeper, and related to that last one, the line depth, omitting the first and the last hooks on the line. As with the sharks, I'll go through each of these one by one. These are circle hooks shown against traditional J hooks. So essentially it's called a circle hook because it's more circular than the J hook, which looks like the letter J. The tip of the circle hook points inwards, which helps prevent sea turtles from becoming hooked if they try to eat bait from the fishing line. Circle hooks are thought to be less likely to incidentally capture marine turtles, although there is some debate about their efficacy as a universal mitigant to incidental capture of sea turtles in commercial fisheries. And there's been a number of studies that show they do have an effect generally, but in other cases they can have other incidents of bycatch. But I do talk about that in a little bit later. Fish as bait. Using fish bait instead of squid bait has been shown to reduce sea turtle bycatch. Why is this true? Some hypotheses include the rubbery texture of squid make it likely that the turtles attempt to swallow it whole, thus swallowing the hook as well. Whereas with fish, they can tend to take bites of the fish around the hook, as you can see in that picture. Sea turtles may prefer squid to finfish as well, due to a natural chemical attractant present in squid. So by using fish as bait, you're maybe not attracting turtles to the hooks as much. The impact of this mitigation is likely to depend on turtle species, the geographic area, and the life stage of the animal in question as well. Shallow set long lines account for the majority of sea turtle interactions with long lines. And you can see there is what we call the turtle layer from the surface down to about 100 meters. And you can see in the diagram, a shallow set long line has all the hooks in the turtle layer, whereas a deep set long line has only two. You can see the first and the last hook there. Species commonly captured include loggerhead and leatherback turtles, and trials have shown that lines set below 100 meters depth have lower total bycatch rates. And if you admit the first and the last, which are the shallowest hooks, will have a similar effect. So you can see how these work together. In terms of seabird bycatch, there's actually best practices in reducing seabird bycatch from an organization called ACAP. It's not so much an organization, it's called the Agreement on Conservation of Albatrosses and Petrels, which has been ratified by 13 countries: Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, France, New Zealand, Norway, Peru, South Africa, Spain, United Kingdom, and Uruguay. The ACAP Seabird Bycatch Working Group is an expert body on seabird bycatch mitigation and develops best practice advice on seabird bycatch mitigations. Now, ACAP, as of 2016, recommends two different approaches: a combination of bird scaring lines, line weighting, and night setting, or the use of hook shielding devices. So again, using the similar process of going through each of these areas, bird scaring lines, also known as torrey lines or streamer lines, how do they work? They deter seabirds from flying, swimming, or diving into the setting area behind the fishing vessel. So as you can see, as the nets go into the water from the back of a boat, these scaring lines prevent the birds from actually getting into that area where the bait is at the surface and slowly sinking. The mitigation essentially consists of a line with streamers hanging down and a buoy attached at the end to create drag. The line is towed from a high point near the stern of the vessel over the area where the bait hooks are deployed. The picture on the right shows you just how effective these can be. You can see the amount of seabirds that are there, and there are hardly any, if any, within the area right at the back of the boat where you can see the hooks will have been, the baited hooks will have gone into the water. You can also further reduce seabird bycatch during line setting operations through the use of line weighting. Line weighting ensures that the baited hooks sink below the diving range of seabirds as quickly as possible. Obviously, it has an increased effectiveness when used with bird scaring lines. You can see from these diagrams, essentially what you're doing is you're greatly reducing the area where the seabirds have the ability to access the baited hooks. Now, night setting, this will come as no surprise to anyone, is when you set the baited hooks into the water at night, and that's defined at the end of nautical twilight to before nautical dawn. Albatrosses and many other seabirds are inactive at night, so they aren't attracted to the bait because they aren't feeding. It is less effective during periods of bright moonlight, though, and it's also much less effective with nocturnal petrels, for example. Birds are actually feeding at night. The other mitigation recommended by ACAP is hook shielding devices. The example I've chosen to show you here is something called Hook Pod. And if you want to know a bit more about that, I put the website down on the bottom left. Hook Pod, the actual pod itself, encloses the point and the barb of the hook during the setting of bait. And you can see on that picture on the left, you can see a bit of squid on the hook, but the barb and the point of the hook are actually enclosed in the pod. And what this means is the birds can't get hooked. Once the hook pod has reached the fishing depth, there's a pressure release mechanism which opens the pod, and the hook and the bait drop out. And I've tried to show that in the diagrams to the right. Once you've done that, you haul the lines back in. The pod can be reused. I've actually got an example of a hook pod that was given to me by the manufacturers, and I've had to play around with it, and it's one of those things that just seems very simple. Obviously, I've not any practical experience not being a longline fisherman myself, but it seems to be a very simple solution to a problem. However, no one size fits all, and it's recognized in people who study bycatch on long lines that there are some unintended consequences of bycatch mitigation. Species are impacted differently by each mitigation method. For example, the use of circle hooks can reduce sea turtle capture, but but it can increase some shark catch rates in some areas. We've already mentioned that long lines at night may protect albatrosses, but may increase the bycatch of nocturnal feeding birds. And prohibiting wire leaders will reduce shark catch, but it can increase seabird interactions because it's not made of metal and it's not going to sink as fast. So this is why, you know, it's not good enough to say, right, just use circle hooks, because it may have a positive impact somewhere, but it may have a negative impact or no impact in other regions. So we really advocate communication with the skippers or the fleets to determine the most appropriate mitigation methods. You know, what are the actual problems that you're trying to solve? It's not, you know, you shouldn't go into this thinking, let's just solve bycatch, because a particular fishery may have a particular problem. Okay, we've got what we're going to show now on the next couple of slides are some examples where mitigations have been used in fisheries. Alexia, are you online?
I think so. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. I hope everyone else can hear. Can someone just say if they've heard Alexia? Great, thank you. Okay, so I shall hand over to Alexia for the next couple of slides.
Great, thank you, Tom. And yeah, so Tom's gone through in the previous slides talking about the bycatch and the longline fisheries, the species that are caught, the reasons it's of concern, and some of the mitigation measures that can be put into place to help reduce these interactions. And now I'm just going to go through a couple of fisheries that have actually implemented some of these measures quite successfully and have shown large reductions in the bycatch in their fisheries through the implementation of a variety of measures. So Tom, you can go ahead and advance to the first one. So the first one we're going to look at is the Hawaii longline fishery. This fishery has one of the highest observer coverage rates in longline fisheries operating within the Western and Central Pacific Ocean. The WCPFC, the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, they require only 5% observer coverage on longline vessels. This even, it's a really low coverage rate, but it's actually not met by a lot of countries that fish in this region. Coverage can be as low as 0, 2%, 3%. So the fact that any countries actually obtaining the 5% is great, and Hawaii has mandated 20% of observer coverage. This is for the deep set fishery that targets tuna. There's also a shallow set fishery that targets swordfish that has 100% observer coverage. These increased coverage rates were put into place because the fishery had high incidence of bycatch of seabirds and sea turtles. The addition of these mitigation measures has been very successful, and it's reduced the incidental capture of seabird and sea turtles by up to 65%, which is quite substantial. Go on to the next case study. Is in the US again. It's the Northeast Distant Fishery Experiment, which is up in the US Northeast and the Atlantic. There was issues with incidental capture of sea turtles in this region. So between 2001 and 2003, NIMS tested a variety of techniques to help determine their effectiveness in reducing the bycatch of sea turtles in this region. During the trials, they had 100% observer coverage on the vessels fishing in that region. And the research suggested that the use of circle baits, circle hooks, large knot, the 18-knot circle hooks or larger, combined with mackerel bait, reduced the bycatch of leatherback and loggerhead sea turtles by 65 to 95%. So then based on this research, the US adopted new regulations requiring these mitigation measures to be used in the net, and it's been proven to be quite successful. The observer coverage rate is not 100% anymore. It's down. It's still much higher than the 5% that's required by ICAT. It ranges from about 7 to 17% depending on the year, but still quite high for a longline fishery targeting tunas. And the third case study that we're going to look at is the Australian eastern tuna and billfish fishery. They've put in a whole host of measures to address bycatch in this fishery. And they actually have a bycatch and discarding work plan, which has recently been updated. They require the use of circle hooks to reduce sea turtle capture, dehooking devices and line cutters that help reduce sea turtles that are incidentally caught and brought on board or by the boat alive. The plan requires Tory lines, line weighting requirements, prohibition on discharge of offal during setting and hauling, and this has all been put into place to reduce incidental capture of seabirds. There's also limits on the number of sharks that can be captured, and other measures like prohibiting the use of wire, trace leaders that Tom had talked about earlier. The fishery aims to observe about just under 9% of the fishery, and again, that's higher than the 5% mandated by the WCPSC. They've also recently gone to using electronic monitoring in this fishery. Ed, I think you're next now.
Thank you, Alexia. Okay, so far we've heard what the impacts of longline bycatch are, how these impacts can be reduced, and you've been introduced to some fisheries where this has been achieved. The final section of the webinar focuses on what you can do as supply chain members in reducing longline bycatch mortalities in the fisheries that you source from. Buyers of tuna, whether directly from the vessels or further down the supply chain, have huge potential leverage reducing the impacts of longline bycatch. Bycatch can be reduced through the implementation of best practices on board vessels, and therefore bycatch mitigation is directly under the control of the skippers and crews of the fishing companies and the directions they receive from the fishing companies. How do we get them to do that? Buyers of tuna really are the best place to encourage what I'm calling the non-regulatory adoption or voluntary adoption of the mitigations described today. And we believe that this can be achieved by buyers requiring best practices in reducing bycatch as a minimum condition of purchasing longline tuna. Well, it's one of the minimum conditions. Obviously, there are other minimum conditions. So it's a case of realizing the importance of the purchasing power. But how do we do that? The longline bycatch report is designed to be a guide for tuna supply chain members, not fishers, that want to source more responsibly caught longline tuna and therefore help improve the environmental performance of the fisheries they source from, as well as identifying the best practices to substantially reduce bycatch of non-target species. The report also offers guidance on how to ensure that the tuna producers employ these best practices. We've developed a stepwise approach, and this is a graphic from the report, and over the next 8 slides I'll just go through each of the steps. The first step is to simply review the longline bycatch guide. This will provide you with a really good baseline of non-technical, non-waffly information, including a summary of the taxa level impacts by target species and geographical locations. By that I mean, if you're sourcing yellowfin tuna from the Indian Ocean, for example, we can tell you that sharks and turtles, for example, are a concern, but maybe seabirds are not a concern. And I just made that up, so if I've got that wrong, I apologize. But you can at least get a high level understanding of what the issues may be in the fisheries. We also summarize the best practice mitigations and the measures that can be taken to substantially reduce bycatch. And there's also examples of case studies there. You can see how other people have achieved huge reductions. The next step is to discuss what your hi Casey, I've got a question from Casey. Yes, I will be sharing the PowerPoint and the recording as well. The next step is to discuss what you were trying to achieve with your suppliers, particularly the producers. I mean, it's really important to state why you want to reduce longline bycatch, rather than just assuming they understand the impacts of it. And I put some examples there. We can help you with the messaging. It would also help to determine whether they're doing anything already. Can they do more? Is there pushback from them? Why is there pushback? Is it financial reason? Is it they don't have the understanding? They don't have the gear? Again, to identify that, then it leads us on to the ability to try and solve the problem. A final point, we also recommend at this early stage you communicate your long line sustainability ambitions to the management authorities. Um, More on this in a later step, but it's important to speak to the fisheries managers, in many cases the RFMOs, to say this is something we're concerned about, and this is something that we're wanting action on. You know, we might be working with our individual suppliers, but it's something that needs regulatory support as well. The next step, before making any requests of your suppliers, you really need an understanding of what the actual issues are. We said before, there's no use saying, everyone we buy from must use circle hooks if that doesn't actually address a problem or actually causes a problem to worsen. Appendix 1 of the report, as I've mentioned just a minute ago, identifies general key bycatch taxa by region stroke target species to try to give you some level of understanding of the issues in the fleets you source from. But we also recommend you use other tools, for example, Fish Source and Seafood Watch tools, that will give you a bit more information, maybe a bit more granular information on the challenges in a fishery. This might not be, it might not give you all the information you need, which is why we do recommend speaking with the vessels you source from. Much more specific data can come from the producers themselves or the suppliers from the producers. What are they catching? What are they seeing on the fishery? Once you get a greater understanding of the issues, it will give you a greater idea of the mitigation measures that should be implemented on those vessels. And once you know these issues, you can start to request action to address them. And what we are suggesting here is incorporating appropriate bycatch mitigations in your sourcing requirements. There's a number of reasons why we're recommending putting in actual sourcing requirements. It makes the expectations to your suppliers fully transparent. By having it very clear and set out, it minimizes misunderstandings and potential obstructions. You can be quite specific, and I've put an example there. We require circle hooks to be, despite my example there, we require circle hooks to be used on longline vessels catching elephant tuna in the Indian Ocean. I mean, that's just a very loose example of something that could be put in there. You might want to be specific about the particular supplier if you know that they have a particular problem. And also, it's important to note that by having it in your sourcing requirements, you're demonstrating the efforts that you and the industry are making towards healthy oceans. This not only does this try to proactively address some of the challenges the seafood industry faces, but it also supports advocacy for regulatory change as well, which is really important. Once you have sourcing requirements that you're happy with, you need to cascade them throughout the supply chain. Your suppliers should cascade them through the supply chain. You should. I mean, I don't want to tell people how to run their business, particularly as I've not been involved in seafood buying, but looking at some best practices in other areas, recommendations of something like this, say, requesting a confirmation in writing of a willingness to comply with requirements. And noting clear deadlines. But like I say, this is an area I've not operated in, so this is purely from best practice examples outside of seafood. If you are a supplier to an end customer, like a retailer or food service, and you're doing this, you should let them know. You should tell them what you are doing. One, it could prompt them into action, but secondly, it also identifies you as a leader in this field. Now, we're expecting some skippers and crew to require support on implementing bycatch mitigation techniques, particularly if they've never done them before. Now, the longline bycatch report is aimed at supply chain members, not fishermen, and it doesn't contain practical advice on implementing gear modifications and technical specifications, for example. We did this on purpose. We didn't feel the need to duplicate this, as there are other organizations, such as ISSF, the International Seafood Sustainability Foundation. They already have and offer such resources. And I've got some examples there that they have videos, fact sheets, and guidebooks aimed not at the supply chain, but aimed at the fishermen themselves. We recommend that the skippers and crew that you're sourcing from participate in training events and are exposed to these available resources. And this is something that we can certainly assist on. And we do work with ISSF, and they are keen to get involved in this. They have these resources available. Ongoing monitoring is essential for a number of reasons. One is to maintain your supplier's best practice. It's all very well to have it. Yes, we'll do this, and we've done it on the first trip, but to insist and ensure that they maintain it. It will also determine whether the mitigations are actually having an impact, positive or negative. It could also show whether it's having unintended consequences, as we've discussed earlier. It might be, yes, it's having a positive impact on turtles, but it's having a negative impact on sharks. If there's no change at all, then it gives you an opportunity to review the mitigation or the implementation of the mitigation. Is it being done properly? Is there further training that's required, for example? So it's a really important step to make sure it's not just a sort of an on-paper exercise. And the final bit, this is sort of out of step really with the rest of the steps. This is about advocating for the adoption of bycatch best practices at a regulatory level. And this is something I mentioned back in step 2 when communicating to the fisheries managers. Voluntary measures in the fleets that you're sourcing from is a good start. But bycatch monitoring, assessment and mitigation, it should be adopted not just at an individual vessel or fishery level, but much wider, nationally or regionally, so that the cumulative effects are addressed. So it's going to have some impact if a number of fleets are doing it. But of course, if all the fleets had to do it, then the impact is going to be higher. So it's better. How we're suggesting that's done is supply chain advocating for the adoption of bycatch best practice at a regulatory level, including the RFMOs. This can be achieved. This kind of advocacy or engagement happens all the time. It can be done a number of ways: making public declarations in support of the adoption of best practices, encouraging producers to commit to publicly disclose data regarding the nature and volume of bycatch for each vessel, to actually highlight the data. Look, we are catching this much. We have made changes, but other vessels who haven't will be doing exactly the same. Contacting the RFMO delegations directly to request regulatory improvements. Now, the first step you can do is signing on to the Global NGO Tuna RFMO engagement letter. Now, almost all of the SR have already done this. For those of you who haven't yet, I think there's only about 4 or 5. That would be a real positive step. In that letter, it actually calls for RFMO action on bycatch, particularly long lines. Signing a letter is a good start, but it's by no way is it the end of the process. And this is something that the SFP, as part of our work with the Global NGO Tuna Forum, is working on, actually turning that interest we've generated into direct action to engage with the RFMO delegations. So a little bit more on that later, but there are steps that you can do now. So a lot of information has been presented. This can maybe feel a bit overwhelming, and it might be feeling a little bit unachievable. So what are we doing to try to help things happen? Firstly, just a first step, we are translating the guide into some key languages. We've already translated into Spanish, and there's a link there. When I circulate the presentation, you'll be able to click on that link and get a Spanish version of the guide if you need to share with your supply chain, for example. We're also in the process of getting it translated into Japanese and Indonesian. Be keen to know, bearing in mind that the guide is aimed at the market, not the fishers, is there any markets that we should be targeting? What languages are priority, for example? Is there anything we should, in your supply chain, you think actually having this guide in a certain language would be helpful? That kind of feedback would be appreciated. And secondly, the big next step for us is we want to establish a pilot project where we work through each step with market partners and evaluate the outcomes. A little bit more on that now. The pilot project is a key part of our fresh and frozen tuna work going forward. We're looking for volunteers from the supply chain. Ideally, I'd like to get an SR participant company who has a willing or will be willing longline tuna producer, so someone they're getting the fishes they're getting the tuna off, and an SFP partner customer, or potentially a retailer. So a company that's got a fleet that's willing to engage in this, plus a customer that would be willing to engage in this pilot as well. So they would take on their role as well, which would be actually calling for it. Ideally, both companies would agree a sourcing requirement for longline bycatch mitigation in a particular supplying fleet, which would implement the mitigations on board their vessels following the steps we've covered. Now, if the pilot happens to be operated as a basic FIP, there may be 50% funding available for this work. That's something we've discovered recently. It's absolutely no guarantees here, but there is an opportunity if we were to develop this pilot into a basic FIP. So we're actually saying this fishery is working to specifically improve one area of the environmental performance through the framework of a basic FIP, then that could attract some funding. As we expect the environmental performance of the fishery to improve, should longline bycatch reduce, the intention is to carry out a before-after fishery evaluation, for example, through fish source, to determine how the improved environmental performance changes the rating of that fishery. Such a change would offer a real tangible outcome of the mitigation measures that have been employed. So we can actually say, we did X and this was the positive result from it. I've actually prepared a short document that goes into a little bit more detail on a pilot, which I will share with the slides from this as well. If you have a particular interest in this, want to see it sooner rather than later, just drop me an email and I can do that. I can get that to you quicker. So, in summary, longlines have negative environmental impacts through bycatch, but the existing tools, mitigations and best practices have been shown to reduce these impacts, and in some cases hugely reduce these impacts. The implementation of this, it can be done at a fishery or fleet level. It's not dependent on regulatory change. A vessel can do this without the need for regulatory change, though we obviously it is much better to have it at a regulatory level. But in the absence of that, getting it employed on a number of fleets is a good thing. The supply chain does have the ability to require best practices on board supplying vessels through sourcing requirements. This is what we want from your product. We want to continue buying it. This is how we'd like you to proceed. There are training resources out there that can help skippers and crews do this properly. We've already mentioned the importance of regulatory change, and that's kind of like a side part to this work, side part, but very much an important part. And we're planning to run a pilot that we want to go through each of these steps to determine that they are the most effective and the most efficient ways of operating. It's a bit of a learning exercise. We want to see, is there anything else we can do slightly differently? Are there things that can work better? But the aim of the pilot is to, at the end, to demonstrate the positive impact of these mitigations. It has already been done with some of these case studies, but the important thing here is working through the supply chain. It's important to say that what I want to demonstrate here is that the market, who is interested in decreasing longline bycatch impacts, has the ability to do this as well. So on that note, I will say thank you very much for listening, and thank you once again for your patience with rescheduling this. Apologies for the earlier technical difficulties. We have only got 7 more days of using this webinar system before we go on to a new one. So it will be the last time you have to suffer it at SFP's hands. I'm more than happy, and Alexia is as well, to answer any questions. We've also got my colleague Jeff from SFP, who's able to answer questions. And we also have Steph Winnard from BirdLife International, who's potentially working with us on a pilot, who's able to answer any questions, particularly on the seabirds side of things. So if you have any questions, more than happy to do that. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask them, type them in the chat box, or if you'd rather email me a question, happy to do that as well. If you are asking a question at the minute, I can't hear you, so you may be on mute. Does anyone have any potential interest in working on a pilot? Great. Someone's commented on the chat an interest in Vietnam, a Vietnamese language version. Thank you. I've taken a note of that.
Hi, Tom. It's Steph Winnard here. Can you hear me?
Hi, Steph. Yes.
Hello. I just want to say thank you very much for the presentation. That was really great. I just wanted to make one point that I'm not sure was covered, but for a lot of these mitigation measures, these are actually already required under the rules of the various RFMOs. So for seabirds, it's actually a requirement for the tuna pelagic longline fleets to use 2 of the 3 measures of the night setting, using those bird scaring lines and the line weighting. So this isn't something that's actually voluntary for fleets. So they should already be doing this. But over the last few years, as these regulations come in, we haven't seen the evidence of the uptake. And for the seabirds, there are still huge declines, which should be slowing down if they're actually being used properly. And I know the same is true for seabirds with the sea turtles using like the circle hooks and stuff. So I just wanted to make that point that this is something that should be already happening in fisheries. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. That's a super point that I should have been much more clear about. Yes, yeah, voluntary measures on some of them, yeah, mandatory measures on many of the others. But as you say, and we've on a couple of times and presentations to this group is we've noted that there's a 5% observer coverage requirement in WCPFC, and it's a handful of countries actually have that. So it's yes, it's another example of the situation we face here. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. So yeah, that's really true, and there's been a lot of work with the RFMOs themselves to try and improve that coverage and trying to get countries to report more. And I think now it's doing this kind of work with the companies purchasing, like there's a really good chance for companies to be able to make a big difference to the bycatch problem, because for fishermen, as for any company, it's really the money that talks. So if they're able to sell to producers because they're using these measures, then that's really going to be the thing that makes a big difference for these endangered species. Thanks.
Okay. If there's no questions from anyone, I will say a thank you again for your time. If you do want the more information about the pilot, quicker than I'm able to ping it out once I've got the recording sorted, do let me know and I can get that out to you. And like I say, the full slide deck will be shared as well as the recording, so you have access to everything there and you don't have to sit through the recording if you just want to see the slides. So thank you very much, and I will end the recording now.